just a few more minutes to come in, get settled. I'll go over a few key topics or points with the Zoom functions, and then I'll hand it over to Barbara to get us started. Okay, so it looks like we've got a fair amount of people in with us. So I'm just going to go over a few key points. We will be utilizing our chat box today. So please be familiar with that. If you have any questions, technical, you can either reach out to myself or Mel Smith, and we'll be able to help you. For attendance purposes, if you could please ensure that your label has been updated to your first and your last name so that we can make sure that we've marked you here. That would be fantastic. I do know we have a couple dial-in numbers. If you have dialed in, please go ahead and message Mel Smith directly. Let us know your name so that when we do utilize our breakouts later today, I can make sure I get you into the proper room so that your audio and your sound, or excuse me, your audio and your video both match. If you have, again, any questions, let us know. You will be able to utilize your reaction button and raise your hand, as well as answer yes, no. And with that, Barbara, I will let you get started.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that we can be together again. While we were waiting to get started, I had this idea. I wanted to have some snappy opening sentence where I would use the word trust as many times as I could. And here's what I wrote. I trust that you have learned a lot about trust while being on our online discussion board and how to build a trusting team. And then after I wrote this out, I realized that what the sentence was telling me is that trust is a verb. It's something that we do, we trust. It's also a noun. It's something, it's a thing that we will really struggle to define, and you have defined so well in the comments that you wrote in your dialogue with each other. And trusting, it's also an adjective, a trusting team. So we're going to be looking at trust as a verb, as a noun, as an adjective, and really try and get our arms around the idea of trust. So let's jump in. And we welcome each other by checking in. So if you would, in the chat box, please write a 1 or 2 word answer, 3 tops. A trusting team is. A trusting team is. Family. A strong team. A happy team. Engaged. Collaborative, successful, honest, cohesive, happy, a machine, essential, cohesive, high-performing, strong, engaged, happy, successful, engaged, worth the time it takes to develop, cohesive, a wonderful thing, great and engaged, transparent, honest, dependable, motivated, efficient, successful, strong, successful, extends grace, connected, successful, transparent, powerful, get things done, focused, being a wingman for each other. You got it. That's exactly what we're moving for, that kind of strength. So let's do that. I want you to know, as we get started, that this is a very ancient conversation. People have been talking about it for thousands of years. Aristotle wrote about it in 350 BC, and he defined 3 aspects of it that will sound very familiar to you right now, and even more familiar by the time we have concluded. That trust is grounded in intention and goodwill, intelligence or correctness of opinions and competence, and character, reliability and honesty. And those are some of the words that already came up as you discussed what a trusting team looks like. And the evidence base is really amazing and so persuasive. Why trust matters. because it leads to more collaborative and cooperative behavior. It increases creativity and critical thinking. Team effectiveness is enhanced as our change efforts, improved clinical outcomes, job satisfaction, increased commitment and intention. And also some, psychobiological studies have shown that trust creates a physiologic response of positive, those sort of happy hormones like serotonin and oxytocin are released when people are in a trusting atmosphere. So we know how important it is. It's an old conversation, and yet trying to define trust and how to create it is like nailing Jell-O to a tree. I've spent a better part of the last decade trying to figure out how to unpack aspects of trust as a noun and a verb and an adjective. And that's what we're going to look at together today. I include this picture because this was an early attempt in organizations to try and address the issue of trust. And I find it so funny. I think you'll recognize this. This is what's called a trust fall. And the idea is team members take turns being blindfolded and dropping into the arms of their colleagues, hoping that their colleagues will catch them. It's hard for me to imagine how that would lead to trust after the exercise is over. We're going to have to be a little more specific, a little more practical, and a lot more strategic. So here is our agenda. We already talked about why trust matters. We're going to talk about whether trust is granted or earned. We're going to walk through together 4 foundations of trust, and we're going to take a look at ways of collaborating creatively using questions. So let's start with a success story. When I began managing the current unit I'm on, I began by leading by example, and I personally provided patient care as a CNA, then as a nurse. I then pulled everyone aside to have a conversation based on their needs and wants. I also asked each one what we needed to succeed as a team. I took notes, I looked for trends. When they gave me a problem, I asked for a possible solution. I prioritized the issues and began to problem solve and utilize some ideas that were given by them, gave praise to them. This helped establish my trust with my peers. After that, I began to tackle the teamwork building by splitting tasks evenly and to be fair, and express the need for communication with nurses and techs. I encouraged autonomy, allowed the staff to feel empowered. Where I'd seen weaknesses, I provided mentoring. At this time, I've given back all job duties to the staff, and I'm finally able to audit and lead fairly and fully while keeping each other accountable. Most staff are now able to come to me and express issues that they have with one another because they feel like they can trust me to handle the issues without making them feel like I will tell on them. Trust is a huge priority to establish early on in order to see the bigger picture. So now, as we always do, please find your chat box. Please find your chat box and write in your ideas about what are your observations, what are the attitudes of your colleague that have allowed her to succeed? What are her gestures? What actions did she take very specifically? And let's take a look at that together. Engaging the team in solution, leading by example, soliciting input, taking notes, looking for trends, leading by example, taking their feedback into consideration, seeking their input, giving praise, asking for solution, leading by example, not micromanaging, trying to understand perspectives before making decisions, leading by example, working with the team, listening first before making changes, leading by example, being an example, empowering them. So much agreement about leading by example, asking for feedback, involvement, not asking the team to do something that she hadn't done for herself, participation by everyone, building the team, leading by example and active listening, open-mindedness, asking for solutions, empowering, giving time for the trust to occur, engaging frontline caregivers from the very start, and then giving credit to the problem solvers, seeking to understand, and that's that listening to understand, walking in their steps, praising ideas, empowering them. And those were all things that took place here, all acts and attitudes of trust. As I read through your case examples and your challenges and your successes, one of the things that I noticed is that your successes were more fulsomely written about than your challenges, and that you have so many great ideas about how to succeed in building trust. And yet there are so many, and here I captured, I think, the most frequent trust issues. A big one is distinguishing what's a performance issue and what's a trust issue in terms of whether there are techniques to build trust or whether there is a pathway for performance discipline and a performance plan. Creating trust as a new manager, the issue of the great nurse and the lousy collaborator, building trust between RNs and either CNAs, nurse assistants, PCTs, nurse practitioners, trust with the night shift, and trust between different clinical disciplines. Coping when a team member has lost your trust. And we always have the one bad apple issue, no matter what we're discussing. Fostering trust when you're understaffed, when you're trying to coach, when you're dealing with a union. And the question of how much information do you have to share in order to build trust? How to maintain trust during change, whether it's COVID, new hire initiatives, maintaining that trust during and collaboration during this pandemic. We're going to talk about that more at length in a breakout discussion. Building trust with your supervisor, medical director, practice manager, and building trust with a disrespectful or rumor spreading team member. Now, as I said, it was very intriguing to me that you had so many positive practices for being a person who can be trusted, and for creating a trusting team and for using trust as a verb. Being consistent, establishing mutual ground rules and goals and vision. Being me, which means projecting authenticity, modeling what you want from the team. And that was really central in the example that we just chatted about. Working alongside the team, meeting individuals and prizing their wholeness, their individuality, not just as people on the job, but people with whole life outside of work, rounding frequently, delegating but with guardrails, following up, warmth and kindness, listening and clarifying, letting your actions speak, recognizing their needs, advocating for their best interest, focusing on what works and not just what's wrong, clear communication, and patience. And one of you pointed out in the last example, and this I think was really a thread, to remember that building trust takes time. And even though we talk a lot, my students always talk about being patient with the patients and being patient with yourself and your team in terms of building that lasting trust. So here are 2 assignments. We're going to do some inner work so that you understand your own capacity to trust and be viewed as trustworthy. And we're going to do work out in the field and talk about how to nurture a trusting team culture. Right. So let's start with one of our 10-second surveys. And Chelsea, I'm going to ask you to drop down the poll. And then I'm going to ask all of you to vote for which one of these statements best captures how you would look at trust. Trust has to be earned and should only come after the passage of time. It's Arthur Ashe. The only way you can make a man or woman trustworthy is to trust them, and the surest way to make them trustworthy is to distrust them. The Russian proverb, trust but verify. Ernest Hemingway, and I kind of tipped my hand because I talked about that in my little preview video. The best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them. And finally, Lao Tzu, he who does not trust enough, or she, will not be trusted. So take some time and think about if you had to choose one of these quotes to capture how you think about trust, what would that be? What would you choose?
Barbara, I'm going to give it another 15 seconds or so. We've
Okay.
got about 67% put in.
That sounds good. Okay. So get those votes in. You don't even have to mail them in.
Okay, it looks like we're holding pretty steady at about an 80% rate of response. So I'm going to go ahead and end and share for you.
Okay. Thank you, Chelsea. So very interesting. We have a very close call here, as you can see, between the best way you can find out if to trust somebody is to trust them and trust but verify. It looks like a certain percentage of you thought that trust had to be earned. And most of you were captured on that continuum of trying to trust and seeing what happens, and or trusting but verifying just by a sliver. So I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward, that you are bringing some attitudes about trust into this, and particularly about whether trust is earned or given. And that's what we're going to look at closely right now. Thank you, Chelsea. All right, so we will send this poll packet. So it's the great chicken and egg debate in leadership about, is trust given or earned? And let me show you in a kind of contrast and compare what that looks like, right? So, and each has an upside and a downside, and I think you've all experienced that, and we'll work from your lived experience in considering this. If you start with Hemingway's idea, or if you start with Arthur Ashe's idea that trust is earned, and you wait for somebody to be trustworthy, and you assume that they might not be or that they won't be, it's going to change the way you treat them. You may not be as eager to share ideas with them, to collaborate with them, to offer support, to give them to delegate to them. And you may even start looking for examples of their untrustworthiness so you can prove your point. And you may not be as open to their positive, trusting words or deeds. Now, that's the downside. The upside is you won't get burned. You won't be surprised. You won't have vested your trust and find out, what was I thinking? Why didn't I see those warning signs? On the other hand, if you work with the idea that trust is given, and many of you did that, if you expect someone to be trustworthy and you assume that they will be, your assumption will also change how you treat them. You may be much more likely to share with them, to collaborate with them, to offer ideas, to delegate to them, and you may start looking for their trustworthiness. You may look for examples that prove, you know what, I was right to put my faith in him, and you may overlook the small and negative things that they do. Downside to that, you can get burned. The middle of all that is trust and verify. And I want you to think, as we move along here this morning, this afternoon, what it means to hold one of these two ideas and how it can very well affect your behavior in building a trustful environment. So let's define trust, right, and your readiness. So trust, one definition is trust is a state of unguarded readiness to interact with somebody. And this trust is defined by a couple of things that are part of all of our lives. One is our capacity to trust, and that is based on life experiences. And for everyone sitting here together, gathered here today, we have all had experiences where we have vested trust and it was a poor investment, and other times where we thought someone wasn't trustworthy and were proved wrong, and other times we stood on the sideline. And so your capacity for trust is very much determined by past experiences. Or your capacity to trust is also, and Aristotle pointed this out as well, the perception of competence. Do they see you competent? Do you see them as competent? And then our old friend, the perception of intentions, the belief that somebody's words and actions and decisions are grounded in good intentions and are not self-serving, that therefore are mutual benefit. And here we go. So can I show a person a way to show that they have good intentions? It's another way of asking, can I give a person an opportunity to show me that they can be trusted? And that's something that I would ask you to think about. That's a question I would ask you to consider. Let's define a trusting team. I had you watch that piece by Lencioni. It's a little video clip on YouTube. And I hope that you watched it. And if you didn't, please watch it afterwards because he lays it out so beautifully. I've got it on one slide and he goes into great detail. So what is a trusting team? Right? And what he really zeroes in on is that trust is the confidence among team members and that their peers' intentions are good and that members can be vulnerable around each other. Now, vulnerable doesn't necessarily mean talking about your Valentine or lack thereof. Vulnerability means that team members are able to admit their weaknesses, their skill deficiencies, their interpersonal quirks and shortcomings. And here's the important piece. They will be able to ask for help and be confident that it will not be used against them. So that sense of being able to be vulnerable and be confident that it will not be used against you is just one of the most important hallmarks of trust. It's at the very core. Here's a perfect example. As time has marched on, I find myself having to work a little bit harder to earn trust as new nurses arrive, and there are fewer nurses that I have worked side by side with. I think of trust as honest sharing of information, listening, learning from others, sharing ideas, and truthful discussion of issues. I also want to nurture the knowledge that I'm concerned about everyone's best interest, the patients and the staff. It's not easy. And usually it means me going first, sticking my neck out, being vulnerable, letting go of control. Self-disclosure is the key. Being vocal about what I stand for. Nurses as professionals, patient and family-centered care, and what I won't compromise about. Patient safety, and what I want, a peaceful place to work. And I think that's a beautiful description of what it looks like when you stick your neck out and are vulnerable about what you care about, what you stand for, what it means, what you're unwilling to compromise about. There's a fascinating study that I wanted to pass on to you because it came up with a phrase that I think is so descriptive and so essential in creating trust. And Amy Edmondson came up with the idea of psychological safety. And it came up in her doctoral dissertation. She wanted to understand the reason for medical errors among hospital care teams. So she followed 8 different units for 6 months. And her outcome, her data was very puzzling. That the teams that had the better performance criteria, they had better quality of care, better leadership, more collaboration, those groups reported more errors. And the low performance teams, the ones that were not as collaborative, not as good patient satisfaction scores, not as good leadership, they reported fewer medical errors. And the reason why they weren't reporting them is because they were terrified of being blamed. And so what Dr. Edmondson came up with is this term, as I said, psychological safety. And it's such an illuminating one. She uses that term to describe the shared belief that it is safe to ask one another for help and to make mistakes, as well as the confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. So that's the job description, friends and colleagues, to make it safe for people to ask for help, make mistakes, and have confidence that the team will not reject, embarrass, or punish them for speaking up. I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward, right? We're going to talk now about 4 foundations of trust: respect, integrity, transparency, and competence. And what you will see over and over again are that list of your best practices will shine in these examples, in these practices, and also you will recognize the trustful and successful work of your colleagues as reported in both challenges and successes on our discussion board. Right. Let's start with a lightning round. 1 minute write-in. There are some shifts that I have in which there could be more team building. The personalities of the staff vary greatly on certain shifts. I can sometimes see a lack of teamwork in a certain group. Some of them have a not my job, not my patient approach. I try to diminish this in real time when I'm able to witness it. When I see an RN sitting idly by while a patient's pump beeps, I model that behavior for them and I check on it for the nurse in another room. Same if I see a nurse drowning and her call lights are going off, I may say to another nurse, I'll get that light while you check on that one, to show them how to help each other when another nurse is overwhelmed. So you see that your colleague here is using something that you all pointed out from our first example, modeling the trustful behavior that she wants in the team, the collaborative behavior that she wants. That she wants to know, how do other leaders cultivate more teamwork and that sense of shared responsibility, which is, it's all our patients. So if you will, take a moment to reflect about this and then write in our chat box the advice that you would want to give your colleague about cultivating that more of a sense of shared responsibility. Recognize team members that help and go the extra mile in huddles or staff meetings. So that sense of recognizing and fanning the flame of the behaviors that you want, both to the people who did it, but also to the people you hope will imitate that behavior. What are some of your other thoughts? Call out good examples on the unit. As a leader, always be willing to, let me back up and see this, always, here we go, always be willing to do what they are doing. Encourage the team to recognize one another when they receive help from peers. Make sure the help is noticed. Praise them. Specifically delegate tasks to the people who don't help each other. And taking time each day to model that behavior and put it on the calendar so you don't forget. Praising individuals in the presence of others. Recognition, clear expectation, making examples of good behavior, being helpful as a leader and appreciative of positive behaviors. Daily huddles where kudos are always included. Recognize behaviors that we want and encourage peer recognition. Thanking the nurse in real time, but also recognize in a shared governance meeting. Be willing to work in the trenches with them. Peer recognition, focused recognition, while others are present. And there's this real thread of recognizing good work, praising to the person and also in public, and add helping others to the unit-based council meetings so that people get a sense, an expectation, I think, here, a shape of how this looks. Recognize team efforts and highlight, continue to work side by side, email kudos, accountability for patient-focused care and behaviors. And be able to put out the idea that when you don't help your team, it affects all of our patients. Peer-to-peer feedback,
How you doing?
maybe brainstorming how we can help
Yeah.
one another,
Mhm.
and continuing to model the behavior that you want. Thanking those who respond. It's wonderful to hear your voice, but somebody might need to mute at this time. Praise and clear communication working side by side. So there's a lot of agreement about what that would look like. All right, let's start with number one pillar. RESPECT, find out what it means to me, saying my queen, Aretha Franklin. Demonstrating respect for different perspectives, offering genuine choices, seeking their ideas when you plan to use them, not as a fake process, seeking the wisdom of their experiences, their ideas, their solutions, offering specific praise and career counseling in light of their strength, praising in public and criticizing in private. Okay, let's see here, that went away. And so many of you talked about the importance of both praising to the person and praising in front of the group. These are the enemies of respect: public criticism, sarcasm, name calling. If you want to wrestle trust to the ground, one of these will do it. No matter how chuffed or angry you are with someone in a group, if you can take a moment and be able to give that criticism in private, keep yourself from labeling or sarcasm, then you will not have tumbled trust to the ground in that moment. Respect. We talked, when we talked about motivation, of the power of choice and control. So beware of fake feedback. And as we've said to each other so many times, ask for solutions and not problems. And that when you do delegate, be clear about who has the authority. So that when we say so many times, empower the team, this is what it means. Ask for choices you will honor. And when you delegate, be really clear about what you're going to do with either the task that you set them out to or the meeting that you sent them to. And when people offer solutions, be really clear about whether you're just looking for inspiration or that you're actually going to put those to a try and give them a trial run on the team. Here's a very long example, but I think a very rich one about respecting choices. We were having an abundance of issues with the dietary department, ranging from not following diet orders to trays not having everything on it and overall poor customer service. I had previously talked with a manager and dietitian without any improvement. The dietitian and I worked together to format a survey to share and give to the nursing staff. About 50% filled it out, and there were some pretty hard things to read as to customer service complaints, but there were some really good suggestions and process ideas to help improve upon our standards and expectations between the department. One of my downfalls is that I try and solve other people's problems. Raise your hand if you relate. When we shared the information with the manager and dietitian, I summarized the situation, the information very briefly, and I followed up with, I'm going to give you some time to process the feedback, and then I'd like to meet again in 1 month. I didn't give myself the opportunity to offer solutions. So we met a month later. They came up with a list of actions with dates on what they were working on and by when they were going to accomplish it. We reviewed the list and set the next meeting in a month. Current status: I have received no customer service complaints from my staff about dietary. Dietary has thus far been meeting their expectations that they've set for 2 months. And I think this was really successful because I took myself out and let them lead the change in their department. And that is really an example of respecting choices. And it has the hallmarks with taking their suggestions and then having a very clear time to get back together, not micromanaging, not kicking in any solutions, and trying out their suggestions and being clear about a meeting and accountability time in the following month. Getting out of the situation and emboldening them to resolve it. That is respect. And respect is also studying and speaking about their strength. We talked about a 3W model. When the person did it, what they did, and why it matters. Here's some great adjectives to use when you are picking out someone's strength: that they are accepting, that they are articulate, that they are flexible, that they're insightful, that they have a good sense of humor to help us see the lighter side, that they're open-minded, that they're resourceful, that they're persistent, that they're passionate. Take a look at those. Sometimes you run out of words when you want to have really specific praise, and so we end up saying good job. And I think that these are really helpful ways. These are the kind of words that really do describe the strengths that any one individual may bring to your team. I recently read a really interesting book by the author of 5 Love Languages, and he wrote a book called The 5 Languages of Appreciation. And it's 2 authors. It's Gary Chapman and Paul White. And what they pointed out was there are 5 ways of conveying respect with appreciation. The first one we've just been talking about, those words of affirmation. And we talked about that a lot in the example of how do you get people to help their peers. So at the top of the list is praise of accomplishment and strengths. There are some other ways that people like to be appreciated, or we could say appreciate being appreciated. The second is quality time. What that means is giving someone focus time, having a quality in-depth conversation, sharing experiences. For some people, that conveys respect. That conveys appreciation. Acts of service, and we saw this, offering help, pitching in, doing it their way. We've seen examples of that. A way of appreciating is taking people's opinions about a solution and doing it their way. It's also jumping in. It's also sometimes answering a call, like it's pitching in. And then the tangible gifts. It's something that somebody values. It might be just like a little gift or a cartoon that reminded you of them, or time off in a certain way. Right? And finally, touch. And I say this with caution, certainly because of the pandemic, but more importantly, because of some of the different ways that we have become aware of the nuance of touches in the workplace. And, so for now, maybe a shoulder pat with gloves on, but these are all ways to think about conveying respect through different kinds of appreciation. And here's some questions I would really encourage you, in whatever metric your organization uses to do a performance appraisal, to consider sending in advance one of these questions. How does your work to contribute to our success? What is it like to work on this team? What does our leadership team do that helps you, and what does it do that gets in the way of doing your work? What makes you proud? What is one thing you've learned in the last few weeks? What brings you joy and satisfaction in your work? What was a high point experience for you since we last met? Where do you see yourself in the next 2 years? Now, for most people, if you just ask that question on the spot, they might not have anything to respond to. So you might want to consider, as a way of really showing respect, is to do a deeper dive into someone's experience, their lived experience. And to be able to say, we're going to meet and go over, whatever it is that your organization has. There's also one question I'd really like to explore with you, or 2, depending, and pose one of these questions. And either start with this question or end with this question. And it's a way of conveying respect and appreciation for them. And when they tell you what makes them proud, restate it to them. So in other words, when you have an opportunity to really bring the team together, you feel that makes it a worthwhile day, right? Now let's do a peer-to-peer case consultation. And this issue, trust between old and new staff, is something that I have heard all over the world, no matter in what language. And so what we're going to do is we'll go over this case together and then take a moment to reflect. And as soon as you have something that you'd like to contribute, raise your hand, and we have the raise the hand function below, and let's hear from you. Currently, we are experiencing a rift and a lack of trust between staff that have been around for several years and newer staff, particularly among ancillary staff. The more experienced staff seems to have little patience with the new staff, and they get frustrated when the new staff doesn't pick up things quickly and have to be told several times. This seems to have frustrated many of them to the point of giving up on training the new staff. The new staff also feel this hostility and feel uncomfortable on the job at times due to feeling constantly judged and demeaned. We have attempted to mediate this by providing one-on-one trainings with all staff, regardless of how long they've been here, but the older staff have expressed this as being a waste of time, right? So something that was tried here is, let's make this training for everyone. However, the older staff felt like, been there, done that. So your colleague wants to know, and has stated truthfully, we cannot successfully orient the new staff without the help and expertise of the older staff. Do you have any suggestions? Right? So let's think about this for a moment together. And then when you have a thought, if you've run into this before, or if you're thinking about this example, if a colleague wrote you an email or called you on the phone or texted you, what advice would you give them? What suggestions would you give them?
As a reminder, you can find your raise your hand function either in your participant window or under your reactions tab. And Barbara, as of right now, we do not have any hands raised.
All right, so let us know what you're thinking.
Barbara, we've got Kathy Wagner.
Hi, this is Kathy. I have never done this in a group, but I have had the experience of a seasoned preceptor coming to me expressing concerns for the orientee. And when that happens, I automatically have this little flag come up. I'm not going to make the assumption that the orientee is totally having troubles. It might be the combination of the preceptor and the orientee together. And so I will ask a lot of probing questions for examples. And then a lot of times we have a discussion, or I invite the preceptor to let's put ourselves in the shoes of this person, and let's think about for a few minutes what may be happening to them. And generally what comes out of that conversation is how the orientee is feeling, just not confident. Mm-hmm. And then that leads to the conversation, what helps a person feel confident? And they have to feel safe to feel confident. And so a lot of times when we get to that point in the conversation, the light bulb goes off. So then the conversation leads to, how do we make a person feel safe when they're not getting things as quickly as we think they need to get? So what can we do to make them feel safe? And so then we have a brainstorming session about that. I've never done that in a large group. I only done it in one-on-one, but that has been successful.
Absolutely. And I want to underline some of the points that you made, Kathy. And first of all is, you really want to ask some probing questions before you assume, is this orientee really going to be a problem and not going, it's not that they're not getting it quickly, they're just not getting it. And this is really concern, and we have to look at that. And then having established some sense of that, what you've described is what the psychologist Piaget calls reversibility. And to really ask someone, well, what do you think that, Tim or Susan is feeling? How do you think this seems to them? And I would imagine that almost without exception, they are afraid of making a mistake, afraid of admitting things that they don't know, afraid that, maybe somehow this whole career is a mistake. Because we hear this over and over again from newly graduated nurses that go into the field and say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that this was actually what it was like to be a nurse, or they come into a new clinical specialty, even though they may have been a nurse for a period of time. And so what you said is almost every time it comes down to the older seasoned staff member being able to see that what's really going on here is an emotional issue. It's a lack of confidence. It's not knowing whether they can trust the person who's trying to train them to just say, you know what, I don't know, can you say that again? And once you've gotten to that piece of empathy instead of annoyance, then you've put that seasoned nurse in the position of being a mentor, being generative, and being constructive. And that just seems like a real recipe for success in this situation, right? So thank you for that, Kathy. Does anyone else want to kick in an idea? Okay, I'm going to add one. And that is that one of the things that I have found, and both nurse managers and directors have told me, and I think that all of us have talked about this issue of a nurse who he or she is just on the verge of retiring, is one path, I think, is to try and animate their sense of generativity and wanting to give to the next generation. So a backdoor, Kathy's approach to empathy is much more straightforward. It is really, well, what do you think she's feeling that's making it hard? And then really going back to Dr. Edmonds' idea of creating psychological safety without getting all researchy about it. But I think one question to ask is, you know, can you remember something that you wish you'd known on your first couple weeks on the job? You know, are there some things that you can remember that you want to pass on to this new person and really invite them into the role? It's an esteemed role of wise, we won't say elder, but wise, long seasoned nurse. So a couple of ways of getting into this is to really, both of them have in common, is trying to imagine the experience of the newer staff and use that as a roadway to get them to collaborate together. Is there anything anybody else wants to add? Okay, let's move forward. Number two, building trust through transparency. Learning to listen and learning from all perspectives. Spelling out your expectations, accountability, what the desired outcomes, straight talk from leadership meeting, keeping confidence, modeling zero tolerance for gossip. I think we used this model one time before. It was a think model. T, is it the truth? H, is it helpful? I, is it inspiring? N, is it necessary? And K, is it kind? And coping with conflict in a timely and specific manner, which really was the whole essence of our time together last time. Here's an interesting and I think a really descriptive example of transparency. My approach to building trust is based on two things. First, I aim to build a relationship with the individual or the greater team. And second, I communicate with transparency. When building relationships, I like to focus on the person first. This establishes an understanding of who they are, what their motivations, likes, and dislikes are. Establishing this type of intro allows them some insight into my focus and my intentions as well. Building on the relationship is a strong communication where interactions take place. Honesty is a priority, as is clear messages. Most issues occur because of poor communication. Being clear and concise is important in building trust. Even if the topic is negative or unfavorable, it can be delivered in a respectful and forthcoming manner. Even if all the information can be explained or can't be explained, even if not all the information can be explained, giving important need-to-know info can go a long way. Finally, sticking your commitments and backing up your promises instill trust. People want to be around someone who's reliable. You know, there's a lot packed into this comment, and many of you have asked, you know, how much information can I give? I want to build trust. There are times when you can't tell all. Tell as much as you can to build trust and to be able to say some of the information has not quite gelled yet, and I will let you know as soon as I do. This sense of keeping to your promises can be so essential as well. We all make promises, and in the moment we really mean, let's talk about this tomorrow, but tomorrow brings so many different ways to move that often that promise is forgotten, except by the person that you made the promise to. That person will remember that you didn't keep your promise. So keep your promises. Right? Listening to understand begins with silence. Paul Goodman wrote this so beautifully, the silence of listening to another person, catching their drift and helping them be clear. We've talked a lot about the difference between listening to understand and listening to respond. And listening to understand has 3 basic steps. Focus on the person, give them their full attention, phone turned off. And then reflecting, as we've talked about, what they mean, stating back to them, because this increases both your understanding and them. When they hear your reflection, they can correct you, and or it helps them clarify what their thoughts are. And finally, the clarification. And Kathy, you talked about this when somebody first came in, concerned about an orientee. Listen to their concerns, reflect it back, and then ask questions, as Kathy suggested, to clarify your understanding. Because questions can help you focus, get new ideas, and be able to focus and explore together some new commitments. And there are a couple of models that we've used for transparency. One is the desk model. Describe what's been observed, evaluate how this affects the team, show what needs to be done, and know and share the consequences if the performance continues to be in the low zone. And very much related, though more in the how this affects me personally, is the DERE model, which is describing the situation, expressing how you think and feel about it, requesting a specific change, and encouraging the positive outcomes. Both of those models build trust through transparency. Now we're going to do our first ever breakout group discussion. And one of the threads that was woven so clearly during many of your successes and your challenges is how difficult it is to maintain trust and collaboration in a pandemic environment. And some of you are dealing with that because your unit has been turned into a pandemic unit. Others of you, and all of us, are dealing with living in a pandemic environment when we leave work. Many of you are dealing with having your kids at home and learning online and trying to keep an eye on that. Others of you are concerned about elderly family members and or the hurt and the heartache of not being able to see some of the people nearest and dearest to you. So all of this contributes to trying to maintain trust and collaboration when everyone that comes into your team, whether your team is clinically dealing with COVID, your organization is, and that every single person in your team in some way is working with, trying to cope with, trying to find strength in this pandemic environment. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to break into some small groups and discuss this. And I want to give you 2 examples just to get you started. Currently on my unit, the cohesiveness that was built working as a COVID unit has diminished. My staff is complaining more and more, call-ins have increased, and I feel that my management team has done all we can to support and listen and be present to hear their concerns. And another person wrote, I am certain that this is nothing new to many of you, but my biggest struggle currently is keeping the morale and collaboration of the staff up during the pandemic. I remained as positive as possible with the staff and have attempted to lead them well during this difficult time, but I feel like I am running out of steam. Not truly knowing if there is a light at the end of the tunnel is making it more difficult. So what I want to ask you to think about, in both of these cases, the person is working in a COVID unit, is concerned about their team. But I want you to bring this out into a fuller circle and realize that every single person in the team and you are dealing with the outcomes and the ongoing stress and pressure of the pandemic environment. And so I would like you to talk about with each other, what are some of your best practices for maintaining trust and collaboration in this pandemic environment? And so Chelsea is going to break folks out into groups, and you will meet for about 10 minutes. So it's 11:55. So by my math, we'll get back together at 12:05. And what I want to ask you to do when you come back is I'm going to ask you to write in the chat box some of the best practices that you came up with, both as individuals and as a group. So we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to go ahead and open all rooms, and you will have a 2-minute warning when we are wrapping up, and we will bring you all back.
Are we all back? Yes? Very good. Okay, in the interest of time, can somebody maybe from your group just write down a couple of ideas or one idea that you had about maintaining trust during this really challenging environment? So let's see if somebody can just write from out of your group or something that you heard that really rang a bell for you. You can write that in the chat box. Being there with the staff when a change comes, checking in, so this being available. And that's very hard on you, and it makes it very much easier for them. Maintaining communication. We've talked about being transparent and honest, being available, relaxation room for staff to take a break with massage chair, coffee, that sounds nice. Celebrating the small wins, being present, talking about non-work things to de-stress, regular meetings, Zoom, transparency, personal recognition from leadership rounds, thankful lattes, that sounds good. Transparency, including everyone in the small things, listening to their home lives, being that sense of all of this together and creating that your team is a space of support, empathizing with the stories of their home COVID struggles, summarizing info so staff doesn't have to go through tons of emails, work side by side, support them through challenges, tea for the soul in the break room, recognizing when things aren't right, town halls, know that everyone is stressed, do fun things to help morale, Valentine cookies coming up, hiding Easter eggs, small prizes, that sense of being present and also wishing and aspiring that the administration would be more visible and maybe being able to ask them, free meals, decorating, fun things. We had a chili cook-off, treat bags, leader rounds at night and on weekends. And I think those are all things that you can do to make it a safer, more trustful environment. Let's move ahead in the time that we have to talk about integrity, which is a third pillar. I mentioned earlier following through on your promises, and so many nurse managers have told me that when they make a promise, they write it down on their calendar. If I said to you, Chelsea, I'll talk to you tomorrow, I'm going to make a note on my calendar that tomorrow I'm talking to Chelsea. Treating team members with the same standards. Now that's real easy to say. That's just boilerplate, isn't it? However, that said, I'm just going to tell you what is human nature, that you're just going to like some of your team members more than others because of their personality, because of the person, if someone reminds you of someone positive. Conversely, there are some people that are just going to rub you a little bit, either because of their particular traits or because of someone else that they remind you of. The only important thing of building trust with integrity is realizing, perhaps, that you are more drawn to someone than else and making that extra effort to be even-handed. We're going to talk more in a little minute about building integrity by gaining insight about yourself, how your behavior affects other people, and the difference between what you intend and the way it hits someone else. And we're going to talk about an apology that has integrity. So let's take a look at those aspects a little bit. In working with leaders all over the world and in most kinds of organizations, especially healthcare and many, many others all over the world, one of the things that I've found the hardest things for leaders to do is to discern what impact their behavior has on other people and get around their blind spots and understand that what I intended to happen is not necessarily the way it is received. There's this nifty little diagram called the Johari window. Joseph Luft and Harry Ingram, thus Johari. And what we really want to look at is the public self, I know it, you know it, the private self, I know it and you don't. But what we're looking at is the blind self, what others know about me that I don't know. And that's what we're really looking at. And we have to be able to have integrity. We have to be able to ask questions to appraise ourselves. And I always think of that line, Groucho Marx, when someone was criticizing him. And he wiggled his eyebrows and he said, I resemble that remark, right? And I think the question we have to ask ourselves when someone comes at us, to have integrity, we have to be able to ask, do I resemble that remark? How does my behavior affect other people? How did I co-create this situation? Is there another way to see this? And one of the biggest pieces of it from a wonderful book by Tanya Urich is the difference between intention and impact. And so many times we say, well, that is not what I meant, or I never meant to hurt you, or I did not mean for that to happen. We have to recognize is what we intend and the impact that it has on other people, that can be a whole world of difference. And part of having integrity is being able to look at, I know what I meant to do in that meeting. I meant to give people as much information as I could so that they would feel empowered. But in fact, the impact is I friggin' freaked them out, right? And to be able to see that, the difference between what you intended and the way that it had an impact on other people is such an integral part of integrity, right? Let me talk about an apology. I think it's great to apologize in any way. Just to say, I'm sorry that I spoke so sharply. I'm sorry that I misunderstood. I'm sorry that whatever. I think the most powerful apologies and ones that have the most integrity are events that become commitments. And what I mean is that you want to be able to demonstrate to the person that you're apologizing to that you actually understood and learned something from the situation. So you want to state when it happened. You want to state the behavior that you're apologizing for. And when you say what you've learned about the situation, your insight about it, you're demonstrating to them that you understood the effect that it had and you won't do it again. And you make a commitment of a promise that you will do or you won't do. And let me show you what that looks like in a specific example. Let's just say that in a meeting you called out somebody about their resistance to something. Here's what would be that event that becomes a future commitment. When this morning in our meeting, I mentioned your resistance to developing a new staffing model for our low census unit. My insight, I realized that you felt embarrassed to have this discussed in front of the whole team. My commitment, in the future, I will talk to you in private and we will make a plan together. And this is so essential because unless the person realizes how it affected you, they can't trust that you won't do it again. Unless the person realizes what specific behavior you are cognizant of that you need to never do again, like call them out in front of a whole group, or that you want to start doing again, how can they possibly trust you? And these are apologies that really are commitments that what happened, what I've learned, and what my commitment is to you really cements a sense of integrity in the situation where you were quite simply wrong. Now I'm going to have some fun and talk about building trust and creativity with collaborative questions. One of my favorite is a worst case solution, and then we're going to do some question storming. All right. There's a great technique that comes from David Cooperrider called reverse brainstorming. And sometimes when your team is really in a jam and trust is kind of about to leave the building and you're discussing a fraught situation, one way to release some energy and release some tension is to ask the questions, how can we make this situation worse? Or how can we achieve the opposite of what we want? And what you find is there's a lot of laughter, and when you flip it, you're getting some really actually good solutions. So let's just do this for 1 minute, given the time. Okay. A challenge that I'm facing in my department is trust between the techs and nurses. Right now, the department is divided because I have a group of techs complaining about the nurses and a group of nurses complaining about the techs. The techs who've been there for years feel like they're just getting complained about, and the nurses are the issues. The nurses think the techs don't respect them. So now what I want you to write in the chat box is, do you have any suggestions about how to make this situation worse? How could your colleague achieve the exact opposite of what they want? The problem is techs are complaining about the nurses and nurses are complaining about the techs. How to make this situation worse, right? So your best ideas about how to make this situation worse. Let's have it. Off the top of your head. Take sides. Tell both of them they're right. Agree with everyone that the other group is the problem. Be passive aggressive. Let's see what else we got here. Agree with everyone. Join the gossip. Ignore the problem. Gossip about them and tell them what they said about each other. Don't do anything. I made mine sit in a room. Tell them to tell it all. Have a group meeting for yelling at each other. Join in the drama. Talk on both sides of your mouth. Tell them they're the problem. Address them separately in a divisive manner. All right. Now, if you had a group that was problem solving about this, you'd probably be laughing. Oh, put the complaint up on the board. Get in the middle of the drama. Agree with both sides. And when you flip it, you're going to see exactly what you want to do. You want to get them to talk to each other. You want to not take sides. You want to be constructive. You want to not humiliate them. You don't want to play both sides against the middle. So you see how that works. It's a way of getting collaboration and also releasing some tension in the room. Right. Let's try another way of brainstorming to create collaboration. This is called question storming, and it comes from the work of Dyer and Gregerson. And so what it is, in brainstorming, you write down every single idea. In this case, as a whole large group, we're going to ask you to pose every possible question about this challenge. Every question, silly, off-the-wall ideas, wild questions. Don't judge or censor any of them. And we'll stop after about 25 questions. And if you were doing this as a group, you would look at all the questions, and then you would pick out the top 5 priority questions. All right, so what I want you to do now is, your organization is looking forward to, roughly a year from now, 11 months from now, when hopefully COVID is under control. And your organization is trying to consider a switch to bedside change of shift report. And in that situation, the nurses, patient, family members would be all in the room. And that the nurses from both shifts would be in the room for handover at bedside, and they'd have a uniform format to go over issues. So instead of discussing pros and cons, or having your team have to trust that they can be critical or thrilled or whatever it is, what you would do in this situation is question storming. And what you would say is, what are your questions? Which is really different than what are your opinions. So what I'd like you to do is look at this and write in the chat box every possible question that you could come up with about this potential change next year. What are your questions? What will be discussed during the report? How do I hand off sensitive information, like psychosocial? What about HIPAA violations? What will the format look like? What if they're sleeping? Here's another one. What do you do off hours when the patient's sleeping? How long is this handoff expected to take? All of the family be in the room? Who will this affect? What about sensitive information? How are you supposed to discuss sensitive information in front of the patient? How will this work? Will there be any info left out during the report? Do they get permission to speak in front of others? What if the patients don't want to be disturbed? Do all the family members have to stay? Why is it necessary? Do we wake the patients up? Do we need to go into isolation room? What if they're light happy, HIPAA sleeping? What about isolation rooms, a waste of PPE? How long will it take? What about double rooms and HIPAA, isolation rooms? What about HIPAA? Who's watching the lights when the staff are in the room? Do you give all of the information? HIPAA, what about Any visitors in the room? How do we know if they're really family? What if the family is in the room? How can we deal with a patient who likes to talk? Do we really have time? Why? How can I show labs? What if the patient says they don't want to do this? What if the patient has to go to the bathroom and delays the next report? What if they've been up all night? Can patients interrupt rounds and ask questions and break our rhythm of reporting, often possibly miss something? These are great questions. And if you did this as a group, you would notice, as we all did together, that there are certain threads that have to do with privacy, that have to do with people sleeping, that have to do with who's present, that have to do with what is COVID, what if COVID is continuing? Are we wasting PPE? And this is question storming. And the reason why it creates trust is you're free to ask a question. You're not standing there and saying, I think this is a waste of time, or I think this is a violation of confidence. You're raising a question of confidence. And question storming can create a sense of psychological safety. And I would really encourage you to use it next time you're in a problem-solving mode with your team and see what happens. I think you will find it very energizing. And so the setup is, the prompt is, what are your questions? What are your questions, right? And finally, we want to look at the fourth and final way of building trust through competency, theirs and yours. A big issue, and we're going to talk about this one a little bit in detail, is modeling leadership competence and high standards versus clinical competence. Because one of the issues that comes up so often for nurse managers and directors is that they are moved into a unit that was not where they were raised. And they think, well, I don't know about this particular specialty. And what I want to say to you is to remember that you build trust through your leadership competence. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And also, competency means knowing what to ask, where to go to ask if you don't have answers. Part of leadership is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And to give up the idea that you build trust by always having the answers is just simply too much pressure, right? And you also build trust in terms of your competency and theirs by asking them what they know, for asking them to learn from each other, and by talking about their mistakes in terms of learning experiences. And finally, delegating to convey your trust in them. And that's something that we've talked about when we talked about motivation. This is such a great example and a piece of advice. My biggest challenge in building trust is with my OR team. I'm lucky to have been an internal candidate that was promoted into the position. So most of the people within my division know who I am, but I don't have a strong OR background, which seems important to those within that area. And so here's his advice. So I'm working to do things that show I can be an asset to their area, even though I may not be able to do their job. And then he talks about leadership competence. The best way I know to build trust is to do what you say you're going to do, always do what's right for the patients, create relationships and know the staff, not just as a nurse in the OR, but also who they really are, their family, their passions, etc. So this question of clinical competence versus leadership competence is one that you will have to resolve and invest in the difference in order to fully build trust. I want to give you a couple other examples. As I became the supervisor and then manager in a unit with very seasoned nurses, I was frank and humble. I communicated clearly that I would never accumulate as much experience as they have, and that I would be honored to lead their way with their help and knowledge. I was willing to learn, listen, and collaborate on goals we had in common. Here's another one. I believe my success in creating team trust in a new clinical area, in other words, new to her, was my openness about my lack of knowledge in the area. I asked them for their help in learning the processes, the workflow, the patient population. I worked alongside my team, getting to know the work they accomplished. They were wonderful teachers and appreciated my inquisitive spirit. I told them I knew how to manage, but they were the subject experts, and I needed to rely upon them for information. Since then, we have all been able to work together bringing our best selves to the table and spreading our knowledge to those around us. So what these two examples have in common is that these managers were very clear and trusted themselves as leaders and developed trust by their team by being frank and clear and humble about what they knew and what they didn't know, and what you as a nurse leader are bringing to the occasion is your leadership competence and not necessarily your clinical competence. You may have both. However, remember that your role is to lead and not to be the clinical expert there. And in that way, you build trust by trusting yourself in your leadership and allowing, by investing in yourself as a leader, they can invest in you as a leader. And finally, in terms of trust and competence, you convey trust in their competence by delegating with guardrails and support. And this is a quote from a nurse manager that I worked with. I'm quickly learning that I can't be present everywhere, and I'm having to learn how to do this in other ways and how to utilize my team, who can be in many different places. I'm also learning to reevaluate what things can be delegated versus what specifically needs to be completed by me. And that's another aspect of leadership competence. So it's a kind of a roundabout way. On the one hand, you are conveying your trust in them by delegating to them. On the other hand, you are reinvesting in your leadership by deciding, as we talked about in our conversation about managing time in light of mission, you are evaluating what's most important and what can specifically be completed only by you. And that is another dimension to your leadership competence. So, as we close, here's where we have been. We've talked about 4 foundations of trust, respect, integrity, transparency, and competence. And as an aspect of transparent communication, we've looked at the art and the practice of using questions like, what's the worst way to do this? And question storming, where every possible question takes the place of an idea or an opinion, even though it expresses an idea, in a way where people can be more transparent about what their concerns are. So I wanted you to ask, as we always do when we close, what do you think is the most important piece of learning or tool or technique that you've had during our time together about trust in teams? And if you can write that in a chat box, as is our way, we will close by taking a look at what some of you have found to be an important piece of learning as a way of summing up our time together. So just write in the chat box what's been important learning to you, what you might like to, as they say, try at home. Question storming. Asking, what questions do you have? Realizing that competence is a big factor in my ability to trust others. Helping others to stand in somebody's shoes or fill in their shoes to encourage empathy. Be a good listener so others can trust you. Question storming, good listener. Intention versus impact. Leading by example. A new way to address change by asking for all questions. This to me is a great tool. What questions do you have for me? And really listening. Question storming, collaboration and communications. It's okay not to have all the answers. Empower those with experience. Good listener by example. Intention versus impact. Not trying to be a content expert and relying on staff. Question storming, nice graphic. Writing down my promises so nothing is missed. Open communication, reverse brainstorming. Leading by example. Knowing it's okay to be vulnerable with your team. And reverse brainstorming. Clinical competence, ugh, I get called to the bedside all the time. I need to show my competence as a leader, right? So a couple more here. Be consistent and have good intention in leading, right? So as we close, I want to thank you for your good intention. We see communication and collaboration. And for really passing on to all of us and being so generous both with your ideas and your best practices for building trust. And I think because we've been able to spend this time together, and I hope that in reading on our chat board, that many of you are realizing that you're already using some of these tools and some of these gestures and approaches and attitudes. And hopefully because we've spent this time together, that you will do them more deliberately. So let me just say to you, I look forward to seeing you next month. And I wish you a happy Valentine's Day, happy Heart Day, and I hope that the coming weeks are certainly filled with challenges, but I hope that they will also be filled with all kinds of love, love for your work, love for each other, love for your family, love for all those around you. Take care, be well, and I will see you next month.